The Yukon has always been a land that resists being tamed. Its forests stretch endlessly, swallowing travelers whole. Its rivers carve through the wilderness like veins of a restless beast. And in the long winters, when the sun refuses to rise for weeks at a time, it feels less like a place on Earth and more like the edge of something vast, unknowable, and watching. People come here to test themselves against nature, to prove that man can endure the cold, the silence, the isolation. But the stories that survive, the ones whispered in truck stops, around campfires, or on the lips of old-timers who refuse to step into the dark again, tell us a different truth. The Yukon does not belong to us. It never did. And those who forget that rule often don't return to remind us. Tonight on Shadow Whisper, we'll step into those forgotten trails and haunted towns. If you find yourself drawn to stories that chill the bones and linger in the silence after the video ends, remember to like this video, share it with those who dare, and subscribe for more nights spent wandering the dark. The first time I understood what the Yukon silence could do, I was only 19. I had taken a logging job for the season, thinking it would be easy money, long hours, hard work, but nothing I couldn't handle. The camp sat at the edge of a forest that stretched so far it seemed endless. A wall of pines standing shoulder to shoulder, their trunks black against the snow. The men who'd worked there longer told me never to wander into those trees alone. I thought they were just trying to scare the new kid, passing down campfire ghost stories. But when I finally ignored their warnings, I learned the silence they feared was real. At first, it felt normal enough. The snow crunched under my boots, the air sharp and clean in my lungs. But the deeper I walked, the more the world seemed to fold in on itself. The sound of the camp behind me disappeared. The creak of branches faded. Even the wind seemed to die. I stopped listening for anything at all, but there was nothing. Not a single note of sound. And in that stillness, I felt the weight of something pressing down, as though the forest itself was watching, holding its breath. I tried to keep walking, but every step felt wrong. My boots sank into snow that muffled everything, and yet I swear I could hear another pair of footsteps just behind me. I spun around, but the trail was empty. Just trees stretching in every direction, their bark dark and wet, their shadows long and unnatural. I told myself it was my imagination, that the silence was playing tricks, but then the feeling shifted. It was no longer the absence of sound. It was as if the silence itself had become alive, closing around me like a hand over my mouth. My chest tightened, and I felt an urge to call out, to break it, to prove to myself that I still had a voice. But the words died in my throat. Some instinct told me not to speak, not to let the silence know I was there. That was when I noticed it, the tracks. Not mine, but another set of prints in the snow running parallel to me. They were fresh, sharp at the edges, no more than a few minutes old. And yet I had not seen or heard anyone. The strangest part wasn't the prints themselves, but the way they ended. After 20, maybe 30 steps, they just stopped. No sign of the walker leaving the path, no broken branches, no disturbance in the snow beyond. As if whoever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. My pulse hammered in my ears, but even that sound felt muted, stolen from me. I turned back toward camp, moving faster than I wanted to admit. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone there, just out of reach, their face hidden between the trees. By the time I stumbled back into the clearing, the noise of the camp, men shouting, engines humming, the crack of axes, was like a lifeline. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, but I didn't go back into those pines alone again. Later I learned that others had seen the same thing. Footprints that began and ended without explanation. Silhouettes glimpsed between the trees, too tall, too thin, their movements wrong, unnatural, and always the silence. Not the peace of nature, but something heavier, something that waited. The Yukon teaches you quickly. Silence is never empty. It's a presence all its own, and once it notices you, it doesn't let you go easily. I thought the first walk had been enough to teach me a lesson, But the Yukon has a way of testing you again when you least expect it. Weeks passed and the memory of those vanishing footprints dulled, buried beneath exhaustion and routine. But the silence returned one night when I drew the short straw for firewood duty. The camp's generator had sputtered out hours before and the men were restless. Without heat, the Yukon could kill you faster than any predator, so I took an axe, pulled my coat tight, and walked back toward the edge of those pines. The forest was different at night. Even with a lantern, the light seemed swallowed whole, reduced to a pale circle that quivered with every gust of wind. The moment I stepped past the tree line, the sound of camp life died behind me as if a door had shut. I told myself I would only gather what I needed and leave. No wandering, no exploring, just in and out. But the deeper I went, the more it felt like the woods had shifted in my absence, rearranging themselves into something older, stranger. The silence crept in again, layer by layer. First the wind disappeared, then the crunch of snow beneath my boots seemed dampened, muffled like I was walking through a dream. Even my own breathing faded, shallow and fragile, until I began to doubt it was happening at all. I gripped the axe tighter, its wooden handle slick with frost, and forced myself to keep moving. The trees pressed closer together, their trunks black and slick as if soaked in oil. I stopped once, raised the lantern higher, and that's when I saw it. A figure, thin, impossibly tall, standing between the trees. Its body was more shadow than flesh, but its outline was unmistakable. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a smear of darkness painted by the lantern's flame. But when I blinked, it remained. When I lowered the lantern, it leaned ever so slightly, as if following the arc of my movement. My throat tightened, the weight of the silence heavier now, pressing against my ears until they ached. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but instinct chained my voice. The figure didn't move closer, didn't retreat. It simply watched. I forced my legs to move, each step dragging like stone. The moment I turned away, I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, but the faintest shift of snow, as if something enormous had decided to follow without hurry. I quickened my pace, the lantern flickering wildly, my own breath finally returning in jagged bursts. The sound behind me never grew louder, never quickened. It was steady, deliberate, as though the silence itself had put on flesh and chosen to walk with me. When the camp's lights finally pierced the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Whatever had followed me had stopped the moment I crossed the tree line. But the silence came with me. I felt it settle into my chest like a sickness, a heaviness that refused to leave. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just outside the edge of sight, too still, too patient. Later that week, one of the older men in camp pulled me aside. His face was lined, his beard white with frost, his eyes carrying that hollow look of someone who had seen too much. He told me I wasn't the first. Others had spoken of the same figure, the same silence. Some men had chased it, shouting into the trees, only to vanish themselves. No body, no trail, nothing, just gone. The man gripped my shoulder and said quietly, "The forest doesn't need to make noise. It listens, and when it listens too long, it decides." That night I lay awake in my bunk, the generator humming faintly in the background. But even with the noise of machines and men all around me, I could still hear the silence waiting at the edge of the pines. Not absence, not emptiness, but something alive, patient and aware. It wasn't long before the silence stopped being just my burden. One morning, a man named Harris failed to return from checking the fuel drums. It was a simple task, less than half a mile down the trail, out in the open where the camp's lights could still be seen. We waited for an hour before anyone said anything. Harris was known for being quick with excuses, but the longer he stayed gone, the more that old dread I'd been carrying began to stir again. 3 men set out to look for him, and when they came back, their faces told us more than words could. They found his tracks in the snow, clear and sharp, heading straight down the trail. But halfway to the drums they ended, just like the ones I had seen weeks earlier. No signs of struggle, no broken branches, no blood. The track simply stopped. Harris had walked into the silence, and the silence had taken him. From then on, the camp was different. Conversations grew short. Men avoided the forest's edge, and laughter, the one thing that had made the long nights bearable, vanished. Some of them started sleeping with knives tucked under their pillows, as if steel could protect them from something that didn't even leave a shadow. One night, as the wind howled against the cabin walls, I overheard two men arguing in hushed tones. One swore he had seen Harris standing between the pines, staring into camp with an expression too calm, too still. The other insisted it wasn't Harris at all, just something wearing his face. When they noticed me listening, they fell silent, but I could see the fear in their eyes. It was the same fear that had been growing in me since the first time I stepped beneath those trees. The silence was changing us. It was no longer confined to the woods. It had seeped into our bones, into the spaces between words. Even in the mess hall, surrounded by clattering dishes and low voices, there were moments when sound seemed to vanish all at once. The room would fall deathly still, every man frozen, eyes shifting toward the walls as if waiting for something to enter. Then, as suddenly as it came, the noise would return, leaving us shaken and pale. 2 weeks after Harris vanished, it claimed another. A young man named McCarthy. He had been sitting by the fire pit, whittling a piece of wood into the rough shape of a bird. I was no more than 20 feet away, talking with another logger, when I noticed the sudden drop, the world folding into silence again. I turned and McCarthy was gone. No footsteps, no sound, no sign of movement. Just the unfinished carving lying in the snow. The knife still stuck in the wood as if he'd been ripped out of the world mid-motion. That broke us. The older men, the ones who had survived season after season in the Yukon, began muttering about old stories, of spirits that fed on quiet, of forests that collected men like trophies. They spoke of names I didn't recognize, old warnings never meant for outsiders like me, and every time the silence pressed in, they would lower their heads and whisper prayers, their voices trembling, desperate not to be heard by whatever was listening back. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, exhaustion, madness born of isolation. But deep down I knew the truth. The silence was hunting us one by one. And no matter how many fires we lit, how much noise we made, it always returned heavier than before, waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. The Yukon does not kill like a storm, sudden and furious. It kills slowly, patiently, with a silence that feels alive. And as I lay awake at night, staring at the frost creeping along the cabin walls, I began to wonder not if it would come for me, but when. The night it all came to a head was colder than any before it. The thermometer nailed to the mess hall wall had cracked, the red liquid frozen inside, a silent warning that the Yukon was done with us. We huddled around the fire pit outside, every man drawn close to the flames, not just for warmth but for company, as though the nearness of others might keep the silence away. But even then I could feel it, heavy, watching, waiting. It started with the dogs. They had been restless for days, pacing the perimeter of camp, growling low whenever the forest loomed too close. That night they went quiet all at once. Not a whine, not a bark. They simply froze, ears flat, staring into the tree line as though they saw something none of us could. One of the older men muttered a curse under his breath. Another clutched a rosary so tightly the beads snapped. Then the fire began to dim. The wood burned bright, flames licking high, and yet the light seemed smothered, swallowed by the air itself. The circle of fire shrank until we could barely see each other's faces. That was when it stepped forward. A figure emerged from between the pines, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that defied reason. It didn't stumble or walk like a man. It drifted, each movement slow, deliberate, as though time itself bent to allow its passage. The silence thickened, pressing against my skull, filling my chest until I thought I'd suffocate. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was stone. Someone finally broke. A man named Dalton, rough and angry, snatched up his rifle and fired into the trees. The sound should have torn through the night, but it didn't. The shot rang out like a muffled cough swallowed before it could echo. The figure didn't flinch. It only tilted its head, studying us, its shape flickering in the dim light as though it were more shadow than flesh. The dogs bolted then, breaking their chains, sprinting into the night as if chased by something only they could hear. Panic spread through camp like fire. Men shouted, stumbled, shoved each other in desperation to get away. But the sound of their voices felt strangled, their cries weak and distant. The silence consumed everything, leaving us with nothing but the sight of that thing watching. I don't remember making the decision, but I ran. My legs carried me toward the cabins, toward the illusion of safety, though every step felt heavier than the last. Behind me, I heard the chaos of men scattering, the crash of wood as someone slammed a door, the faint snap of branches as the forest swallowed them whole. I slammed my own cabin door shut and pressed my back against it, chest heaving. The silence filled the room like smoke, crawling into the corners, pressing against my ears until I thought my head would burst. And then, faintly, I heard it, a voice. Not loud, not sharp, but a whisper, so close it felt as though it came from inside my skull. Stay. One word. That was all. My lantern flickered violently, shadows leaping across the walls like writhing hands. I gripped the axe at my side, but the thought of swinging it at whatever waited outside felt like madness. This was not something you could fight. This was something you endured. When dawn finally came, pale light spilling across the camp, the silence lifted. The forest returned to its normal hush, the dogs nowhere to be found. The snow marked with tracks that led nowhere. A third of the men were gone. No sign of struggle, no blood, just gone. Those of us who remained packed up what we could that morning. No one spoke, no one argued. We simply moved, our faces pale and hollow. By midday, we abandoned the camp, leaving behind the cabins, the fire pits, the machines. Leaving behind the silence, but I know it followed. I feel it still even now, years later, when the night grows too still and the world around me holds its breath. The silence waits, and once it knows your name, it never lets go. They say there are roads in the Yukon that don't bother with maps. They ride the spines of old ridgelines and sink through muskeg like black threads pulled through wet cloth, then vanish under snow for years at a time, waiting for the wrong set of tires to find them again. The first time I drove one, the sky was a gray lid pressed low on the world and the truck heater rattled like a loose tooth. I had a crate in the back I didn't dare open, and a promise to deliver it to a drill site that never stayed in the same place for long. On the paper directions, the road didn't have a name. It had instructions instead. Pass the rusted snowcat. Keep the river on your left until it disappears under ice. Turn where the pines lean as if they're bowing. If you see the red survey flagging, you've gone too far. Turn around. Don't stop. The cut appeared where a plow must have once bullied through, its edges ripped and frozen. The middle packed by animal tracks and a single set of tire marks older than the last snowfall. The trees on either side leaned inward, their crowns knitting tight until the day turned dim. I dropped the truck into four-wheel and let it crawl. Snow hissed under the treads, the windshield wipers smearing frost into pale crescents. The CB sputtered with dead air. I tried the radio, caught a snatch of a hymn, and then only static. A long whisper like someone breathing across the speaker. For a while the world narrowed to hood, glass, and the tunnel of trees. Then the first shape appeared on the right. A shoulder-high mound of snow with a sharp corner protruding. I slowed, rolled down my window, and stared at the metal sticking out. Green paint blistered with white letters I could still half read. Row, then a dent, then OSE. A road-closed sign, devoured right where it stood. As if the forest had taken a bite and kept chewing. I put the window back up and kept going. The farther I drove, the stranger the road felt beneath me. Not rougher, wrong, like the truck floated a fraction off the earth, hitching down a path that wasn't there a second before and might not be there a second after. I caught sight of impressions frozen into the snowpack along the ditches, the crescents of boots, the narrow rails of a sled, the faint stamp of a dog team. Prints layered on prints until the whole shoulder looked scrawled with the traffic of a place that should have been empty for years. When I stopped at a bend to breathe the feeling out of my chest, I realized my exhaust plume wasn't drifting the way it should. The cloud climbed up and stayed, stitched to the trees, a gray flag that refused to move. I shut the engine off, and the silence didn't fall so much as reach for me. It wasn't the same dead quiet from the camp. This had a texture, a grain to it, like the hush inside a church where the air keeps the last note of a hymn folded in its ribs. The road ahead curved left around a bulge of spruce, and at the corner, a shape stood where the snow should have been smooth. Human height. Human stillness. I told myself it was a stump. I told myself a lot of things. Then I turned the key. The truck refused for a beat, as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear, and then the engine rumbled awake. I took the corner slow. The shape remained where it had been, and as I drew even with it, the truck lights brushed what I can only explain as a shadow carved into the world. No depth, no detail. A man-shaped absence darker than everything around it. The beam slid over and didn't catch. It passed through as if light had nothing to do with whatever stood there. I didn't stop. I pressed on until the spruce thinned and the sky lowered into a slate sheet over a flat, where the wind had sculpted sastrugi into frozen waves. The older tire marks veered right toward a line of poplars, and so did I. At the next dip, I saw the second sign this road belonged to other people's bad decisions. A door. It lay on the snow with its paint shaved by storms, a single brass hinge clinging to one edge, the other edge splintered where it had been torn from a frame. A crow had walked across it, leaving perfect three-toed prints that began at the handle and ended in empty white. Up ahead, the trees broke entirely, and the road lifted onto a low causeway over muskeg, wood timbers black with age, frost blooming on every bolt head. On the far end, headlights burned toward me in daylight that didn't want them there. I slowed, blinked, and counted. 2 lights, level and steady, sizing me from a distance that didn't seem to change no matter how long I crawled forward. My mirror showed nothing behind but the arch of trees closing. I flashed my brights once, a courtesy hello in a place where that still meant something. The lights didn't answer. They didn't flicker. They didn't move. I told myself there was room for both of us on the span. I told myself if I stopped here, I'd never move again. I rolled onto the timbers, the truck shuddering as the tires found each frozen plank. The beams moaned in a voice that felt older than the cut line, older than the men who first laid them. Halfway across, the opposing lights drifted sideways without turning, sliding along the far shore like eyes traveling a face. I watched them trace the line of the poplars, dip behind a fallen trunk, and rise again 20 yards left of where they had been, as if the thing wearing them didn't know what a road was for. I made the far side and pulled onto solid snow. The lights halted in the same instant, fixed in a place that would have put their vehicle nose down in the ditch. A breath steamed the glass inside the cab. Not mine. It hung right in front of the dash, a trembling oval on the windshield, then smeared away slowly as if a hand had dragged through it. I didn't speak. I didn't even exhale. Somewhere under the truck, the timbers groaned again like a warning, and the CB hissed to life. A voice spoke so quietly I had to lean in, not a word. Just the end of someone's breath pushing through the speaker. The exact sound an exhausted person makes when they finally let go of whatever they're holding. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then the line went dead. I put the truck in gear and followed the cut as it curled into the trees again, thinking of the door with the crow prints and the shadow that light refused to touch. In the mirror, the twin headlights winked out like someone had pinched them between their fingers. The road tightened, the woods leaned, and the feeling came over me that I wasn't driving forward at all but being drawn along the groove of a place that had learned how to pretend to be a road long enough to decide what it wanted from me. The farther I followed that road, the more convinced I became that it was leading me somewhere I was never meant to see. The trees thinned, then pressed close again, their branches clawing over the hood, tapping at the glass with frozen fingers. Snow sifted down even though the sky above had cleared, falling only where the road ran, as if the air itself wanted to bury the path while I was still on it. The CB hissed again, and this time the voice was clearer. A man's voice, ragged, like each word cost him something to say. "Turn back." Just 2 words broken by static. Then nothing. I snatched the receiver and spat out a reply, but my voice echoed through the cab as if the mic wasn't even live. The speaker stayed dead, and yet I swore I heard breathing, faint and uneven, lingering after the static faded. I drove faster, the truck bouncing on ruts that felt too deep for the snow to have hidden. Every bend showed me more proof that I wasn't alone. A collapsed shack half swallowed by drifts, the roof peeled back like a rotten tooth, a line of fence posts marching into the trees before stopping mid-stride, and once a single boot upright in the snow, laces frozen stiff, no tracks leading in or out. The strangest moment came at a fork I couldn't remember being marked on my map. To the left, the road narrowed, choked by brush and snow piled high. To the right, the cut stayed clean, the snow even as if freshly packed by tires I hadn't seen. I stopped to think, and the engine idled rough, rattling the whole cab. That's when the shadows arrived. They stretched long across the snow, but not from my truck, not from the trees. They slid forward like they'd been waiting just beyond the corner of my vision. First 1, then 3, then a dozen. Human shapes blacker than the night, flat against the road but standing tall in their own way. Their heads turned toward me, though they had no faces to turn, only outlines. And when I shifted the wheel, they shifted with it, bending in unison like they were tethered to my decisions. I wanted to back out, to put the truck in reverse and never look at this road again. But the fork behind me was gone. Where the snow should have held the ruts of my tires, there was nothing but untouched white, smooth as a sheet of paper. I had no choice. I took the right-hand cut and the shadows followed, sliding along the ditches, lengthening as if they were growing hungrier with every mile. The headlights found something ahead, something that froze me more than the figure in the trees or the breath on my glass. It was a sign. Fresh wood, bright paint, yellow letters that gleamed even under my weak beams. Road ends. Beneath it, another nailed crooked, "Do not enter." But the cut didn't end. It ran on into the dark, flawless waiting. My hands locked on the wheel. My pulse hammered in my throat, and the shadows crowded closer, stretching over the hood, clawing toward the windshield. It felt less like I was driving now and more like I was being driven. The road pulling me forward into a place it had carved out of the world just for me. The false end of the road loomed ahead, the yellow letters glaring back at me in the beams. Road ends. Do not enter. My foot hovered over the brake, but I never pressed it. Something in me knew that stopping here would be worse than continuing. The shadows pressed tighter, sliding across the hood, flattening against the glass as though they wanted to seep inside. Their edges rippled, breaking and reforming, and though they had no faces, I felt them watching me. Hungry to see what choice I would make, I eased forward, the sign trembling in the wash of my lights before it fell away into the dark. The road beyond narrowed, but the snow remained unnaturally smooth, like it had been laid down minutes ago. My tires made no sound, not a crunch, not a hiss. The whole truck floated forward as though the earth itself had been erased and replaced with something thinner, fragile, false. 100 yards past the sign, the shadows peeled off from the ditches. One by one they crossed into the headlights, standing upright on the snow. Their legs didn't sink, their outlines sharpened, the void inside them blacker than any night I'd ever known. They didn't walk, they slid, gliding step by step into the center of the road until I was driving straight through them. For a breathless instant, their cold seeped into the cab, crawling into my skin like needles of ice. The steering wheel felt wrong beneath my hands, as if I were gripping something alive, pulsing faintly in time with the shadows outside. I wanted to floor it, to push the truck until the engine screamed, but the speedometer barely rose. Every time I pressed harder, the resistance grew, as if I were trying to drive through water. The shadows lined the road now, standing shoulder to shoulder like mourners at a funeral, heads bowed as I passed. Each one whispered as I drew near, faint, broken syllables I couldn't piece together, like the remnants of a language buried in the frost. The sound slid under my skin, left me shaking, left me with the sick certainty that if I understood a single word, I'd never leave this road alive. Up ahead, something glimmered, not light, not exactly, more like the shimmer of heat on asphalt in summer. A wavering veil stretched across the road. The shadows pressed closer, eager, their whispers swelling into a tide. I slowed, heart hammering, sweat freezing on the back of my neck. The veil rippled once, and for a moment I thought I saw through it. Not more forest, not more road, but something vast and wrong. A horizon that bent the wrong way. A sky with no stars. The truck lurched violently, throwing me against the wheel. The veil pulsed as though breathing, and then the CB flared alive again, shrieking with static before a voice tore through. "Don't let it take you. Keep driving. Don't." The rest broke into a wet, gurgling silence. My hand shook as I shifted gears. I couldn't think, couldn't reason. There was only instinct, forward or back. I risked a glance in the mirror. The road behind me was gone. No headlights, no trees, no sign of where I'd come from. Only a wall of black, absolute and final. The veil pulsed again, closer now, spilling its sick shimmer across the hood. My breath rattled. The shadows leaned in, their featureless heads tilting toward me like a jury awaiting a verdict. I gritted my teeth, slammed my foot on the accelerator, and drove straight into the shimmer. For one impossible moment, everything vanished. No road, no truck, no sky. Only silence thicker than stone wrapped around me like a burial shroud. Then the truck slammed down, tires biting into gravel, and I gasped like a drowning man breaking the surface. I was back on the cut road. The sign was gone. The shadows were gone. Only the trees remained, arching overhead, their branches swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The dashboard clock blinked midnight, though I knew I'd been driving for hours. The Yukon has roads that lead somewhere, and then it has roads that lead nowhere. But this one had led me somewhere in between, a place carved out of the world, waiting for whoever was foolish enough to follow. I should have turned around the second my tires hit solid gravel again, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid the road would vanish if I stopped. Maybe I already knew it would. So I kept the truck crawling forward, hands locked on the wheel, eyes fixed on the pale tunnel of headlights ahead. The trees felt different now, older, their bark twisted in ways I hadn't noticed before. Branches hung lower, brushing the roof of the cab like skeletal fingers. And though the shadows no longer walked beside me, their whispers clung to the air, faint but insistent, threading between the static of the CB like a song I almost recognized. A mile passed, or 10. It was impossible to tell. The clock on the dash had frozen at 12, the second hand twitching but never moving. My stomach told me hours had passed. My body told me days. Still the road went on. Still I drove. At one point I thought I saw lights through the trees, a cluster of them glowing faintly amber, swaying as if carried by hands. Relief nearly broke me. A settlement, I thought. Lanterns, people. But as I slowed, the lights scattered, weaving in and out of the trees with impossible speed before winking out entirely. My headlights fell on nothing but trunks, the snow unbroken. I whispered aloud then, just to hear my own voice, just to remind myself I still had one. The sound was thin, frail. It disappeared before it could reach the windshield, as though the air itself devoured it. My throat closed, my hands trembling on the wheel. That was when I saw the boot again. The same one I'd noticed earlier, upright in the snow. But this time there were two side by side, and this time they weren't empty. The figure stood perfectly still, its body facing the trees, its boots sunk shallow into the white. I slowed, watching for breath, for movement, for anything that might mark it as human. There was none. As I crept closer, the beam caught its outline. A man's frame, but hollow, the edges fraying like cloth in the wind. I blinked and it was gone. Only the boots remained, half buried, untouched. My chest tightened. I pressed on. At last, the cut widened into a clearing, and beyond it, a paved road shimmered with ice. Real asphalt. Real gravel shoulders. The kind of road that belonged to maps. I could have wept when my tires hit it. The steering eased. The hum of the engine sounded natural again. For a moment I thought I had escaped. But when I looked in the mirror, the cut line wasn't there. The forest behind me pressed flat, unbroken, as if no road had ever existed. My tracks ended at the tree line, vanishing into snow. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a warning. I didn't tell anyone what happened when I made it back to town. How could I? They'd have written me off as another drifter gone half mad from cold and sleepless nights. But the Yukon has a way of letting its secrets surface whether you speak them or not. A week later, I overheard two truckers talking in a diner. One said he'd taken a shortcut out near the river, following directions scratched onto a piece of scrap paper. The other shook his head, said there was no road there, not anymore. The first insisted, said he drove it clear to the old mining site, said the strangest thing happened when he looked in his rear view. The road behind him was gone. Nothing but trees. I left without finishing my coffee. The whispers in the CB followed me out the door, faint but there, clinging to me like frostbite. That was when I finally understood. The Yukon doesn't just have forgotten roads. It makes them, it carves them out of the silence, leads you down them, and then erases them when it's done. And once you've been taken that far, even if you make it back, you never really leave. I can still feel it sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night. The pull at the edge of vision. The faint glow of headlights where no car should be. And always, the knowledge that somewhere in the dark a road is waiting. A road that remembers me. The first of the houses leaned at the edge of the tree line like a man who had fallen asleep standing. Its roofline sagged, shingles curled and black with rot. The windows were filmed in frost so thick they looked blind. We'd been riding snowmobiles for an hour along an old telegraph line, skirting a river that kept muttering under ice, when the pines broke and the town appeared. 5, maybe 6 structures, some with their faces caved in, one still wearing a porch like a smile it couldn't keep. On the map it had no name. The old-timer who sent us here called it the place where the houses remembered you for dinner. He laughed when he said it, but not with his eyes. We killed the engines, and the world exhaled. The silence here wasn't empty. It came with a faint ticking, wood shifting in frost, nails reconsidering their grip. I stepped off the sled and the snow took me to the knee, dry as salt. My partner Eve lifted her goggles and squinted at the main street, if a trail of doorways can be called that. Quick in and out, she said. Check for salvage, shelter if that squall comes early, and go. Her breath steamed, then shattered on the air. We chose the house with the intact porch because it seemed to want us least. The others faced us openly, doorways yawning like mouths. This one kept its door half turned from the wind, the porch sagging to hide its threshold. The knob was iron, patterned with tiny flowers. My glove stuck to it. I had to peel myself free. Inside, the light from the doorway walked 3 steps and then gave up. The room smelled like old flour and cold metal. Our headlamps sketched furniture where there shouldn't have been any. 3-legged chairs, a stove on bricks, a table bowed in the middle as if it had carried a great weight for too long. On the table lay a dishcloth folded into a neat square. I didn't like that. The whole place sagged with years and storms, but the cloth was crisp, corners aligned, as if someone had just stepped out to fetch water and would be back in a minute to wipe the same emptiness they'd been wiping for decades. Eve kicked snow off her boots and tapped the wall with her knuckles. The sound didn't echo, it sank. "Good beams," she said, then flinched as a door down the hall clicked. Not opened, not shut. Clicked, as if a latch had thought better of something. We set our packs by the stove and tried the flue. The damper stuck, then turned with a little moan. I fed it a handful of birch curls and a match, and the flame climbed with the reckless confidence of something that didn't know where it was. The heat made the room rearrange itself. Frost lifted from the window glass like a veil. Patterns emerged in the floorboards, scratches where chairs had been dragged, a dark oval under the table where countless boots had rested. And there, by the door, a pair of scuffs angled toward the threshold, overlaid by a second set pointing back inside, like a conversation between leaving and staying that never finished. "I'll check the pantry," Eve said, and stepped through a doorway barely wide enough for her coat. Her headlamp swung out of sight and the house seemed to inhale. A beam shifted above me with a long, tired sound. The folded cloth on the table had drifted a finger's width toward the edge. I must have breathed on it, I told myself. That was all. The pantry door eased in its frame. Just a fraction. The lamp on my head caught the hinge brighten and then dull again. "You good?" I called. "Empty jars," Eve said. "And something. Hold on." Glass clinked like teeth. "There's a loaf tin, clean." She paused. "Too clean." The stove coughed and the fire slumped. "Not out." Smothered as if the air had grown heavy. I fed it more curls. The flame lifted, wavered, then pressed low again, like a dog flattening when a stranger enters the room. "Eve," I said, and the way my voice sounded in that place, thin, apologetic, made me angry at myself. She came back with the tin in a jar so clear it had to be new. No dust, no film. She set them on the table, and the table seemed to accept their weight with a small creak of relief. The folded cloth had reached the edge now. Another breath and it would fall. I watched it. It didn't move. And then, without any wind, without either of us touching it, it slid the last fraction and dropped. The sound was too loud for a thing so light. It struck the floor and lay there in a perfect square. Eve and I didn't look at each other. We both pretended that hadn't happened. She ran her glove across the jar's rim and showed me her palm. No dust. "This place has been closed a long time," she said. "So why is anything clean?" We ate a protein bar each because food is a ritual that tells your hands what to do. I put the wrappers in my pocket, and when I raised my eyes, the boots we'd left by the door had changed positions. Not by much. Just turned a few degrees inward, toes together like a listener leaning close. The house ticked again, and somewhere deep in its ribs a latch lifted and settled, lifted and settled. The way a sleeping thing tries a new position to carry its dreams. The fire found a little courage and pushed its light out another step. In that new circle of warmth we saw the knife. It lay on the counter by the stove, blade pointed toward the room, handle angled toward the door, an invitation. I hadn't unpacked our knives. Eve hadn't either. This one had a wooden handle rubbed dark by a long dead hand. The edge was clean, too clean. "Don't touch it," I said. She wasn't going to. The knife moved anyway, only an inch. The light on the blade shivered. The point ticked against wood. A floorboard under my heel answered with a faint groan as if the house were adjusting to make room. I looked at Eve. She looked at the door. Outside, the first threads of the squall had begun to stitch the world shut. The storm didn't ask for permission. It arrived with a fist of fine snow that pushed under the door and sifted across the floorboards like salt spilled from an invisible hand. The wind caught the corners of the house and shook them, not violently, more like a reminder. We barred the door with a split length of spruce we found behind the stove, wedging it between the frame and a notch someone had carved there long ago for the same reason. I fed the fire again, watched it flare and then settle low, as if the chimney had learned to breathe only shallowly. We did the smart things first, the things that feel like armor. We checked the back room for leaks. We found a basin under a drip that didn't drip anymore, a rickety bed frame with rope lattice gone slack, and a coat still hanging from a peg. When I touched the coat, a puff of stale air rose like a held breath released. It was heavy with frost that hadn't melted, even in our lamp glow. Eve said nothing, just traced a finger along the peg and showed me the clean line in the dust. Something had taken the coat down recently, then hung it back up wrong. In the kitchen, our boot prints softened. I noticed it because I kept looking back at the door. The edges of our steps blurred, and then while we watched, the snow we'd tracked in evened out to a thin gray film. The exact shape of our passage into the house was erased like a chalkboard wiped with a tired hand. When Eve crouched and pressed her glove into the floorboards, it left no new mark. The house had learned our weight and stopped recording it. We spoke quietly, not out of respect for the storm, but because the rooms felt too close for anything louder. The lamp hissed. The stove sighed. Somewhere under the floor, something small moved, a dry rustle, then stillness. The knife on the counter turned another careful degree toward the middle of the room. "We should sleep in shifts," Eve said, trying to make it a question and failing. She had the look she gets when she's counting exits. We agreed without discussing who would take first watch because the house decided that part for us. A hinge whispered in the hall, and the door to the pantry eased itself half shut. I didn't want to find it closed later with someone behind it. I took first watch. Eve lay down on the rope bed with her coat as blanket and her gloves still on, face turned toward me and one eye half open. I sat at the table with the folded cloth still on the floor by my boot, like a napkin waiting for a meal. The fire kept time badly, flaring and fading without rhythm. When it dipped, the cold pressed in so quickly my teeth ached. When it rose, the warmth didn't reach the corners. The air merely thickened, heavy with the smell of iron and wet wood. The jar on the table fogged from the inside. I wiped my palm across the glass and felt it cool and dry beneath my skin. But when I lowered my hand, a faint smear remained on the inner curve, just at the level of the lid, as if someone had breathed there and was too shy to show their face. I forced myself to eat another bite of the bar I'd been saving, not because I was hungry, but because the act of chewing made noise and I wanted the house to know who made it. I set the wrapper beside my elbow. When I looked again, it was gone. Not fallen, not blown. Gone, and in its place a single crumb the size of a seed. The seed was wet, as though a tongue had touched it. I stood too fast, the chair legs grating like complaint. Eve jerked upright, hand to her knife that she hadn't admitted she'd kept. I didn't tell her about the wrapper. I pointed at the counter. The knife there had traveled again, now parallel with the edge. The point lined with the seam between two boards. It had moved without the tiny clatter it should have made. The boards beneath my feet answered with a groan that came too late, like a word you remember after it's useful. "Outside," Eve said, as if suggesting a walk. The storm hammered the windows in a steady hand. We both knew we weren't going anywhere. The house made a new sound then, one I had heard 1,000 times elsewhere, but never as a verb directed at me. The larder door licked shut. Not a slam, not a click. A tongue drawn along wood. The soft, sticky kiss of it, and then the old latch settled happily into its notch. I don't know what made me do it, but I lifted the folded cloth from the floor and placed it back on the table. The square fit exactly into a faint pale scar where it must have lived for years. The house sighed. The fire stood taller briefly, and thanks. "Okay," I said. To the boards, to the beams, to the thing in the jar. "We're neat." Eve's laugh came out like a draft sneaking under the sill. She rubbed her hands and nodded at the door we'd braced. "If it wants us here, it'll keep the weather out," she said, gambling a truth we both wanted. The storm obliged, or the house did. The wind gentled into a hum along the eaves. The window panes stopped their shiver. I checked my watch and found it slow by an hour that felt stolen. Eve took second watch without argument. I meant to sleep only a handful of minutes, but the mattress, ropes and slats and a coat for a pillow cupped me like a palm. I sank, and in the sinking I dreamt that the rooms slid around us, polite, compositional, like furniture dragged across a stage between scenes. I woke to the softest tug. Not pain, not threat. A suggestion. My glove, which I had tucked beneath my head, was on my chest with the fingers curled over my sternum like a hand not my own. Eve sat where I had sat, chin in her palm, eyes bright with all the light she wouldn't give the room. She lifted a finger and I kept still. "Watch," she mouthed. We watched. The jar fogged again. The folded cloth crept 2 millimeters, paused, crept 2 more. The knife made a minute adjustment, keeping itself parallel to the seam as if following a line we couldn't see. Our boots by the door kissed together until their toes touched. And from the back room where the basin waited under a drip that did not drip, we heard the clear, patient sound of water rising against metal as though a slow rain had begun in a house with no roof to justify it. "Hungry?" Eve whispered, not as description but as diagnosis. The fire leaned toward the room like a listener. The house arranged us more comfortably. Eve's chair scooted a finger's breadth closer to the stove without scraping. My pillow lifted enough to let breath go down easy. For a ridiculous second, kindness warmed me. Then I counted our bars and found one gone. I stared into the dark doorway where the pantry had licked itself shut. The latch glowed a little with cold. On the counter, the knife waited, respectful, patient, pointing along the seam toward the place where the wall and the door and the floor conspired to make a corner. No light was brave enough to fill. I understood, as clearly as if the house had spoken in a voice we could bear, that we were the meal and the manners both. Feed it neatly, leave no crumbs, breathe on the glass so it can learn the shape of our lungs. "Dawn," I said, and the house tasted the word the way it had tasted everything else. We tried to pretend the house hadn't spoken, but it had. Not with words, but with the grammar of small adjustments, the syntax of things put into places they preferred. Eve set the loaf tin back on the counter, very carefully centering it on a pale rectangle that suggested it belonged there. The stove brightened in approval. I lifted the jar, and because I didn't know what else to offer a hunger that wasn't for food, breathed into it once, slow and steady, then turned the lid a quarter as if to say we understood a little and would not be rude. Something in the walls relaxed. Not the creak of timber, more like fabric exhaling. The pantry latch loosened. I opened the door with 2 fingers and found the shelves bare, but for a line of dustless circles where jars had once sat. On the lowest shelf, the dust carried a small sure mark, the crescent of a fingernail dragged through once, then twice, then a third time. The arcs nested like a signature. I closed the door and fought the impulse to wipe the mark away. Eve watched the fire lean and said, "It wants a day." She didn't mean daylight. She meant the shape of it. Dishes where dishes go. Boots where boots go. Breath on glass at the hour when a man checks the weather. The word made sense in my chest even if it sounded foolish in my mouth. "A day," I said back, and the folded cloth, without any breeze to help it, slid half an inch to meet the jar. We gave it what we could without giving ourselves. I swept the floor with my glove like a bad broom. Eve tightened the rope lattice under the bed and straightened the coat on its peg. I set the knife parallel to the board seam as it wanted, and then, defiant, turned it back a hair to prove we were still here. The blade quivered, decided not to argue yet, and stilled. The storm quieted to a sift. Snow whispered at the windows and then lost interest. The house warmed, not by degrees but by confidence, a heat that came from approval rather than flame. In that lull, a smell rose from the stove that wasn't our kindling. Flour waking up, iron going honey warm. A sweetness you only get when an oven remembers bread. For a moment, hunger knocked at us from the inside. Eve closed her eyes as if the scent were a song she used to know. When we opened them, the loaf tin held nothing, of course. But it held the idea of something, and the idea was strong enough to make the fire stand proud. I said, "At first light we go." And the house considered the sentence the way it had considered dawn, tasting the edges of it, testing where it would live in its arrangement. We tried the door. The spruce bar lifted easily, our notch in the frame admitting it had done its work long enough. The latch turned with the small pleased sound of metal remembering why it was made. The door opened. Cold air laid a hand across my face. Ordinary cold, not the thoughtful cold we'd carried in with us. The porch waited. The world beyond white and silent, the squall's back broken. For 3 long breaths I believed the house would let us go. Then the porch boards flexed barely. A swell moved under my boots like the heave of a sleeping chest. The snow on the steps lay too smooth, as if varnished. My eyes tracked our sleds and stopped. They were where we'd left them, half buried under wind. But the harnesses had been unbuckled and coiled correctly. Straps fitted into their own loops. Buckles nested. Not malice, etiquette. A host straightening a guest's coat while deciding how long the visit should last. Eve touched my sleeve. Her voice came in very quiet. Look. The other houses across the drifted street faced us with their dead windows. But what I had taken for frost ridges on the glass arranged themselves into shapes, arcs like fingernails. Children's ghost drawings, breath flowers at mouth height. Not one house, a block. All of them trying to learn our day through the glass. I shut the door gently. The latch seated with an almost contented click. The knife, which I had left a hair out of true, lay now exactly parallel to the seam again, patient as a ruler. We'll leave at first light, I said, even softer. And the house, relieved of having to argue, let the stove tick and the warmth stay. We sat and traded sips of melted snow from a cup we didn't own. It felt like cheating to use its dishes, but the cup fit my hand like it had been waiting for it. Eve ate half a bar and set the other half on the table without looking at me. The cloth crept to meet it. The half bar slid an inch, then 2, then was gone when we blinked. Not snatched but removed the way a practiced waiter clears a plate without jarring a conversation. Not food, Eve said. Not really. She tapped the table's worn oval with her knuckle. It wants the motion. The having and the taking. The tasks. We gave it a few more. I mended a cord that didn't require mending. Eve checked the flue and reported its stubbornness, and the stubbornness relaxed in response to being named. The basin in the back room filled to the lip with a rain no roof admitted. When I leaned over it, the water wore our faces like a memory it was trying to keep. Hours later, watchless hours, clock-stuck hours, the window panes silvered. Not sunrise yet, but the promise of it, a pallor out east that houses seem to know before people do. We packed our actual things while leaving the arrangements we'd made. Cloth square-centered, cup rinsed and turned on its mouth, knife aligned to seam. I breathed into the jar one more time and tightened the lid. The glass held the ghost of my breath like a kept word. At the door, the spruce bar waited where we'd set it. Not replaced, not wedged by invisible hands. When I took the latch this time, the metal felt warmer than it should. The door opened to a town reset, snow re-smoothed. Our sleds again neatly harnessed by someone who preferred tidy conclusions. Last thing, Eve said, and picked up the folded cloth, then put it back down again in exactly the same place. The house answered with a single satisfied pop in the stove. A kernel of pitch in the birch going from solid to flame. A tiny applause. We stepped onto the porch. Frost made a quiet sound like sugar underfoot. The air was thin and bright. We took 2 steps, then 3, and looked back. Through the window, breath wrote itself on the inner pane in a small, careful oval at the height of a child's mouth. It lingered. It drew a shape inside itself, a line, then another, until it had made the simplest thing a house can ask for. A hand. It stayed there, patient, open, expecting ours on the other side. We didn't put our palms to the glass. We stood there, the cold creeping into our sleeves, and let the house wait. The little oval of breath on the inside held its shape like a coin under ice. Eve's mouth bent toward a smile that didn't quite land. It wants courtesy, she said. Not surrender. She raised her hand slowly, hovered it a few inches from the pane, and bowed her head the way you nod to a host you won't stay with. I did the same. The breath oval trembled, widened, and then smoothed flat as if a warm cloth had been drawn across it. Behind us, the stove made a small, satisfied crack. We took the steps sideways, palms never touching the rail. The snow took our weight with the soft grit of sugar, and the town watched us with all its blank windows. Our sleds waited in a posture of readiness that didn't belong to machines. Harness rings lined up, straps coiled true. A lanyard I had broken weeks ago lay mended with a knot I would have been proud to tie on a good day. None of it felt like a trick. It felt like someone had gone to trouble on our behalf and expected us to notice. I straddled my sled and thumbed the primer. The engine coughed twice and then found a steady breath. The sound should have kicked against the houses, should have sprayed echoes into the street. It didn't. It folded into the rooms like another chore remembered and sat in its place. Eve's sled woke with the same quiet obedience. We looked at each other because we had run out of reasons to delay, because the world sometimes decides in your place and all that's left is to match its timing. We eased forward. The street gave us a channel, subtle but there, a thinning of drift that shaped itself ahead of our skids. At the first house, the blind window brightened from within and then dimmed, the way a room does when a person stands to see you off and then sits again. At the second, the door pressed inward a finger's width, then licked itself shut. We didn't speed up. We didn't wave. We rode like people leaving a wake, slow enough that nothing tips, steady enough that nothing falls. At the corner, the place where the telegraph line sloped toward the river, we stopped because stopping there had felt right when we arrived and felt necessary now. I looked back. The porch we'd used had already reset its snow, soft and unmarred. No proof of our passage except the arrangement we had left inside. Through the window, the cloth held the center of the table. The knife lay parallel to the seam. The jar sat with its lid turned true. The breath didn't return. That was our gift back, restraint. Names? Eve said, and the word startled me more than any sound the house could have made. In the Yukon, some places keep what you give them. You don't carve your initials into spruce unless you want the tree to remember the exact letters that weather you. But Eve was right to ask. There is a difference between being eaten and being hosted, and naming sits between. No names, I said, but thanks. It sounded foolish in air that could freeze a man's spit before it hit the ground, and yet the street seemed to take it, tuck it into itself the way a careful person folds a note and slides it into a cupboard. We rode the line out of town. The sky had the color the world takes on just before it admits morning, a tender metal gleam along the eastern timber. In that light, the houses looked almost ordinary, wood and nail and snow load. But when the wind moved, it moved carefully around them. I kept my eyes on the swath ahead, but the back of my head felt warm the way you feel a gaze at your neck. When the last roofline slipped behind a stand of birch, the warmth left. The sound of the engines took themselves back. The river's mutter found us again under its ice. For a mile, neither of us spoke. The trail stitched between knuckles of rock and swales where drifts could bury a man to his armpits. The cold got honest again. My visor fogged and cleared in small, irritated breaths. When we paused to drink, I opened my pack and found everything inside standing at attention. Packets squared, matches dry in their tin. The thermos cup threaded on by a hand that knew the thread better than mine. A wrapper I'd jammed in weeks ago had been folded into a neat little boat. I didn't show Eve. I put the cup back on gently, and I think the wind approved. Back at the edge of the tree line where the telegraph posts die into newer work, we cut our engines and let the silence tell us what we'd taken with us. It wasn't the jar. It wasn't the knife. It was the day the house had made for us, a shape that had slipped over our hours and begun teaching our hands. I felt it in the way I set my sled upright on its stand, in the way Eve shook snow from her sleeves from cuff to elbow, not elbow to cuff. The world had always been hungry. Today it had taught us how to feed it neatly. At camp that night, we kept our boots together by the door without speaking about it. We folded our coats on the same peg we always threw them over. The stove ticked like a creature content to have its work named. When the men asked if we'd found anything out there worth hauling back, we said, "Shelter and let it be." Their laughter came easy, unafraid. Ours didn't come at all. We ate, we rinsed the cups. We turned the knives along the seams in the table's scarred boards because the motion acknowledged something that had followed us home, and because not acknowledging it felt rude. Toward midnight, the wind went still. Frost grew its ferns on the inner panes in a rush you could hear if you were quiet. I woke to use the latrine and saw, on the far window over the mess sink, a small oval of fog at the height of a child's mouth. It wasn't there long. It didn't draw a hand. It only held, then smoothed away as if a house a long walk north had thought to check whether we were sleeping, and had the manners to leave without being seen. We didn't go back to that town. We didn't need to. The houses here were enough, if you looked at them long enough to see the emptiness under their paint open its eyes. And sometimes, on a day when the chores line up and the stove learns your patience and nothing falls from your hands because the world is holding them steady, you think, hunger isn't always teeth. Sometimes it's arrangement. Sometimes it's a square of cloth that stays where you put it and waits for your breath. The river began to talk louder as the thaw approached, and with it came other stories. The kind that walked the banks and listened for footsteps. The kind that teach you the difference between water that rests and water that remembers. We learned to keep our lanterns low near the shore. We learned to mistrust the sound of our names over moving ice. By spring, the river had begun to speak louder. It never truly slept in winter, not here. Under the white lid, the water kept moving, a soft, relentless murmur that reached the ear through ice and bone. When the thaw loosened the seams of the world, that murmur rose to a voice. Men said the water was only ice snapping, banks settling, floes rubbing their teeth together. I said it too until the night it knew my name. We were camped where the bank slumped into a gravel tongue. The kind of place barges kiss when the season turns and small crews run fuel drums upriver to villages that don't bother the highway. Our job was simple. Scout the track the ice had left along the shore, mark snags and sweepers, and make sure the first run wouldn't take a man's ribs out with a misstep. Eve hated rivers. She hit it with jokes about fish that had learned to drag men under by their bootlaces. But I watched the way her eyes slid off moving water, as if the motion could hook them. I told her we'd be 2 nights, 3 at most. She said we'd be 1 if I had any sense. The first night was honest cold, the kind that cleans you down to the hinge, and the sky hung a green veil over the black, aurora smudged thin as breath. The river wore a skin of rotting glass. In places it lay clear enough to see stones ghosting on the bottom. In others it buckled with ridges that creaked like old chairs when you stepped near. We strung a line from willow to willow and tied ourselves to it when we went out. A belt for the world's waste. The safety talk made us feel civilized. The river was patient and did not argue. At midnight the wind fell. Sound ran farther. You could hear frost grow, bark crack, the small seminar of mice discussing our crumbs. Beyond all that, underneath it the river kept up its lecture. I woke to it threading my dream, not in words I knew but in the rhythm of syllables, the way a fluent language sounds through a wall. I sat up and the syllables sorted themselves. They made my name. Not shouted. Offered the way a person says a name at the edge of a question. Are you awake? Are you there? Will you answer? Eve slept with her hat pulled low and one hand on her knife as if that were the way people were meant to sleep. I lifted the tent flap. The world outside lay polished and careful. Moonlight put a blade on every twig. The river didn't show its face, only its restlessness. Dark seams crawling under the ice, the long body turning over to test its weight. The line we'd strung hummed once in a breeze that never reached my cheek. Don't, Eve said. Eyes open now, voice low and oddly tender. Like a person calling a dog back from a porch it shouldn't step on. It can hear you stand. I'm not going on the ice, I said. It was true and not. I was already out of the tent. Down by the edge the smell of iron was strong, old blood and wet stone. The river said my name again, just 1 syllable this time, as if trying out the sound in its mouth. I told myself I was hearing the suck and release under the skim. the way currents say vowels if you give them a consonant to lean on. The water swelled beneath a black pane and a palm-sized patch fogged from underneath, like a man exhaling into glass. I crouched without meaning to. The fog held, then drew itself into a small oval at the height of a child's mouth, and the thought struck me so hard I almost laughed at my own fear. The house again, the breath on the window, the patient hand. I touched 2 fingers to my lips and then to the air, a courtesy offered to something that might understand the shape if not the intent. The ice answered with a sound I have never heard anywhere else, a vowel pulled long and thin through teeth. It sounded pleased. Eve's boots whispered on snow. She didn't come close. "Listen," she said, and the word slid into the water as if oiling a hinge. The river repeated it badly, les, tenad, and then made our names again. Hers first this time, the vowel mangled, the rhythm perfect. She swallowed it down like a curse and pulled her hat farther. "It learns fast," she said. Back from the edge, I obeyed by inches. The ice near my toe shelled itself into slivers with a dry sigh. Beneath, something pale rolled and withdrew. Not a fish, not a stone, the color of a palm shone through skin. I forced air in and out, made my breath deliberate and dumb. "We'll mark the sweepers at first light," I said, as if the water needed a plan to rest its head on. The river talked to itself then, a stream of low syllables, almost laughter. We slept like people who are watched. The second night, a fog moved along the channel without touching the bank, a white band that traveled upright as a column would march. It carried the smell of thawed silt and dead leaves dragged from 100 miles. When it reached our camp, the CB woke, though we hadn't brought it for water, and a voice from nowhere scraped along its throat with a single word: "Trade." It said it again, softer, so that you heard the T scrape down to a D, the way a tired mouth lets a consonant fall. Tra-D, not question, invitation. I could feel it lean into the tent fabric, into the line strung from willow to willow, into the cords of my arms as if they were all the same material tied to the same post in the same current. "What would you trade?" Eve said to the dark. "That we'd accept." The river answered with a shudder like joy under ice. My name, then hers, then a third I did not know and did not want to. Near dawn the fog thinned. The oval of breath returned on the ice's underside and stayed too long. A tap came from beneath, light as a knuckle on a table when a person is too polite to interrupt but cannot wait any longer. At first light we worked like people who owed the water respect and feared the interest. We strung more line along the bank and cut willow wands for markers. Bright flagging snapped to their tips so the first barge crew could read our path at speed. The ice wore a bruise-colored sheen, the sort of surface that looks solid until it teaches you the word sheer. Eve tested with a spud bar, 3 strikes per step, patient and mean. On the 3rd strike the bar would speak up if it had bad news. The river made language of those taps, threadbare syllables forming around the steel. "Ta-ta-ta. Listen," it said back, and the sound shivered into the flows like a lesson passed from pain to pain. We found last season's work half-kept. A faded ribbon strangled in sedge. A bleached stake gnawed to a worry bead by spring water. I drove a new stake and the ground accepted it with a wet cough. When I straightened, the old ribbon that had no business moving lifted an inch and lay itself across the new wand. A tired grandmother of a gesture that still meant blessing. Eve spat into the snow without ceremony. "Don't fuss," she told the water. And it fussed anyway, pushing a little wave under the skim to show it had hands everywhere. By midday the wind backed. The channel darkened. Somewhere upriver a floe broke with a sound like furniture thrown down a stairwell. Our line hummed once, no breeze. And in the same breath the CB woke from the sled, throat clearing the way a man clears it before asking for credit. "Trade," it said again. Careful and close, the D softened to a lilt. Tra-day. I went to the set and thumbed the transmit out of habit. "What do you want?" I said, and hated myself for furnishing the river with a grammar it could use. Static lifted like a veil. The word came back threaded with a second voice that wasn't a voice, more like the glide of water over ribbed sand. Names. Eve didn't wait for me to answer. She knelt, pulled a coil of rope from the sled and set it down on the ice between us like a plate placed for a guest. "We'll trade routes," she said to the channel, not polite, not rude, just correct. "We give you your names, you give us your bottom." The straight shot. No pockets, no stinkholes, no cross-current that looks like help. She laid a palm to the ice with the grave assurance of a woman swearing on a book she respected but did not fear. "We say the snags out loud and you stop saying ours." The river breathed through the shards at her wrist. The ice fogged oval and small, and the fog didn't make a hand this time. It made the long line of a channel drawn with a child's concentration. I saw its curve in the cloud and felt the map hook into my head. Shift left at the alder sweepers. Hold the inside bend at the gravel tongue. Avoid the black seam that looks like safety but isn't. The fog held. It learned us leaning. "All right," I said, and gave it gifts only a river wants. I named the dead alder that'll pull a boat sideways and drown a small man from the knees. I named the snag that looks a stick and is a tree. The boil that wears a hat on windless days. The false eddy by the broken drum that never lets anything back out once it takes it. I spoke them like names of the dead at a remembrance. Not because the river needed my help to do its work, but because speaking them made a shape the water could grip. With each name, the ice answered in little mechanical ways that had nothing of machines in them. A seam whitened, a rim lifted. A faint crease walked across a flat to show where the bottom rose. Eve followed the signs with her spud, confirming what the river gave with strikes of iron. Honest work braided to a lie we both pretended was only weather. We moved the wands accordingly, and the channel opened its throat a fraction. The CB clicked as if someone had thought better of speaking and then spoke anyway. It said my name with a care that made my neck go hot. It said Eve's in the cadence she uses when she's not angry but will be if pressed. Then it said the third one, the one it had offered in the night and I had refused to know. Hearing it plain made my tongue sit wrong in my mouth. Not a local. Not any man I'd worked with. A woman's name, simple, syllables clean as a bell. The kind that belongs to someone who answers when her porch light comes on. "What did you trade for that?" Eve asked the dark water, as if it might confess the arithmetic. The river rolled under ice in a lazy shrug. A pressure wave shouldered the skim until a plate rose and tipped, and from beneath it something bumped against the edge by my boot. A leather strap, swollen and black, attached to a small pouch creamy with silt. The sort of thing people wore when they believed hands could keep what pockets could not. I didn't touch it. The current insisted, tapped the pouch against my boot again like a friend trying to catch your eye across a bar. "Don't," Eve said. Same tone she used with the porch light when it tried to call us downstairs. "It's a receipt." The river liked that, laughed the way water laughs, a roll against the gravel that made every stone ring its own name. The pouch turned and slid back into the seam, not taken, not surrendered, just filed. We worked until shadows sharpened into their evening selves. My body kept account, the watch didn't. The line hummed twice with no wind, and I had the petty thought that the river enjoyed having a conversation that required no breath. "One more," I said to it, and offered the name of a man the current had taken last year because he trusted a quiet patch that had been quiet only once. I spoke his family name because names mean a path to a kitchen, to a table, to a voice that answers yours from back of the house. The fog under the ice shaped itself into a curve I hadn't learned yet, and showed me where to swing wide around a lump of black water that pretended to be nothing. The river did not say thank you. It is not a house. It does not clap when you put the cloth back in the right place. But it thinned the ice a finger's width along the way we would advise the barge to go, and that was gratitude enough to trust. Dusk took the tin out of the light. We coiled rope and shouldered the spud bar and stamped our feet until the ache retreated to our ankles. As we turned for the tents, the CB ticked a nervous knuckle. "Trade complete," it said. and the last word blurred into a sound like a stone rolled in the mouth. Complete. Then the line died and the air closed around us like hands. Back at camp, the river quieted itself to a breath 1/10 canvas thick. Eve wrote the channel on a scrap map with a pencil worn to a thumbprint. I laid out the wands and counted them twice, each bright tip a candle along a path we'd speak into other men's mornings. The fog slipped along the channel without touching the bank. It was headed somewhere we would not advise anyone to go, somewhere a third name might be waiting for the cost of being called. We banked the stove and put our boots toe-to-toe. I lay down with the spud bar for company and the river at my back like a wall too busy to hate me. Sleep took the edges off everything until a tap woke me again. Soft, impatient, through ice, through silt, through the line, through the radio's unplugged throat. A single word rode up from the dark, pronouncing itself with our accent now. Comfortable and sure. Part 3. 700 words. The word rode the canvas again, less a sound than a pressure that shaped the air in our mouths. More. Eve didn't answer it. She wrapped the guy line twice around her palm and leaned back, as if the tent itself were a tug-of-war rope and she intended to keep our side from slipping an inch. I set my boot against the stove box to feel something that could not change its mind and said nothing. Because I had learned, in houses and on roads, that speech is a door you don't get to close once the dark knows the hinge. We worked at first light with a quiet that counted as strategy. I marked a snag where the bank caved, said nothing to the channel about it, and the ice gave no fog in reply. The river sulked with the dignity of an old thing forced to wait. When we reached the bend where the gravel tongue lay like a sleeping spine, the CB clicked on by itself. More, it said, and then, trying for charm, pleat. The P dragged across the teeth like a stone. Eve answered that one. Depth, she said, and rapped the spud bar once. You want more, you give depth. She spoke numbers as she read the ice. 1 handspan, 3, a thin knuckle where the bottom rose in a hump that would take a boat's bow if a pilot trusted the wrong shine. The river tried to repeat the count and turned it into weather. 1 syllable thinned to wind, 3 thickened to a low roll that felt like weight in the knees. It understood the shape, if not the units. That seemed to satisfy whatever patience passed for its courtesy. The fog sketched a faint path ahead, and we moved wands to match the lesson. But the word came again in the afternoon, walking up the line from our anchors into our wrists. More. The CB offered it like a waiter who has kept your table too long. The channel gave the word back in under-ice breath. More. It had learned how to say it without breaking it. Not names, Eve told it. Not ours. Not anyone's. She cut the tail of a willow wand clean and let the strip of bright flagging fall to her boot. Have these instead. She spoke the names of the river's own furniture with the style of a person reciting kin. Scowbank, Deadman log, pike hole, cat's paw chop, kettle boil, sweepers, sweepers, sweepers. Saying them touched something in the water that made it breathe easier, as if you had finally called someone by the title they earned. We found the pouch again where the seam dragged slow as a thought. It turned end over end, swollen leather winking pale where silt had rubbed it soft. This time the tag stitched to its mouth showed. The little rectangle of cloth most people stopped seeing after the first week of wearing it. Letters bloomed through wet like wounds shining. A first name I recognized not at all, and a last that belonged to a family that sold hardware upriver when there was still money and nails. The current nudged it against my boot with a patience that felt like a hand insisting you take a gift you cannot afford to owe. I lifted my foot. The pouch bumped the leather once more, then drifted down the line and settled against Eve's heel like a dog that had chosen another master. She didn't touch it. Not this kind of ledger, she told the channel and bent to pick up a stone instead. She set the stone on the tag, another on the first, then a third. The little cairn looked ridiculous on the ice, like a memorial that had forgotten its ceremony. The river laughed low in the bottom of its throat. Then it tipped a plate and rolled a tongue of black water beneath the cairn until the stone shifted, floated, and were gone. The pouch bobbed once and slipped under the pane, filed again in whatever cabinet carries the river's debts. We tried another thing. No words, Eve said. See if it understands that. We worked that next reach in absolute silence, spud notes only, rope talk with our hands. The river tolerated it the way a stern ant tolerates a child's experiment. Expressionless, unimpressed, present. The fog did not rise. The seams did not brighten. We had knowledge enough to lay a safe line without its lessons, but the work took longer. And the dull ache of being watched took root between my shoulder blades. When the CB finally clicked in protest, it did not say more. It played us to ourselves. It repeated a laugh I had made at dawn, thin and embarrassed. It gave back a little snort Eve had let slip when her gloves stuck to steel. It said my name the way my mother said it when she wasn't calling me to come but to stop. That broke something small and stubborn in me. I had thought the north had frozen hard. I said very softly, "You're quick." Gratitude slid along the ice as a shiver so fine the eye couldn't see it. Only the teeth could feel it. "Then take this," I said, "because a bargain is only safe when you can name your own half and leave that." I gave it a list of distances and the polite names pilots use for ugly things. I read off bearings we'd checked twice and the final trick of the current where the channel braids in the left-hand run pretends to be the right. It drank every measure. The fog under the ice traced a long, clean slide that made even my stubbornness loosen an inch. We shifted the last ones. The path stood there honest and plain. Dusk leaked in. We drew back to camp like men who had slung a heavy log between them and needed to set it down. The stove snapped bright. The canvas ticked where frost tried to nail the night to the seams. We ate without talk and folded our wrappers into boats without meaning to. More came once as a tap through the pole. We refused it by laying our boots toe to toe and pretending sleep. Once, twice, a third time the tap sounded, patient as a neighbor who knows you're home. Near midnight the fog returned, not along the channel this time, but right across the tent floor. It was not fog at all. It was a bulge lifting the canvas in a slow, round breath, a small oval of cold printed up from underneath, exactly where a mouth would be if the under-ice had a child and the child had learned a trick from a window far to the north. The oval held, widened, and then a shape pressed gently against the canvas. 5 small lengths, splayed and hesitant, as if asking whether our palms were ready yet. Eve's hand found mine in the dark. "Don't," she said, and I knew she meant my voice, my skin, my name, my everything. The CB clicked. The word came one last time, fluent now, all its teeth in order. We didn't answer the hand. We let the oval chill the canvas and kept our palms on our own sides of the world. The word came again, more soft and confident now, all its letters in a row. Eve leaned forward until her breath flattened the spot beside the print, not on it, and said evenly, as if she were reminding a stubborn animal that it knows the trick already, "Work, not names." The CB clicked in our packs like a tongue behind teeth. The handshape stilled. We took the bargain outside where the river could hear its own voice. Stars had thinned to a gray rind over the peaks. The channel lay black in long, slow muscles. "Work," I said aloud, and the under-ice fog lifted in a faint ribbon as if the water had nodded. We set to it like penitents, wands in a line, each flag readjusted to the breath of the current, each seam tested, each boil named for what it does, and not for what it's taken. Eve tapped the spud bar in trochaic time, hard soft, until the river began to fold its own rhythm around hers. The CB muttered weather without words. More came once, a question this time. Eve rapped the depth. I answered with distance. We spoke the dead man log and the false eddy and the gravel tongue again until the channel's fog traced us a throat you could run a barge through without prayer. It wanted payment at the end. You could feel it gather itself, the way a listener leans when a story is almost over and wants there to be another chapter. The hand printed the tent wall again, lighter. "More," it asked, and, too well taught now, "Please." I could feel the third name waiting at the edge of my mouth like a cough. I swallowed it back until the old ache in my chest returned, the one the houses had gentled by teaching us how to place a cloth. "Work," I said again, and laid what I had left on the ice where it could see the shape. A coil of line, a knife turned along a seam, a cup set mouth down to show patience, 2 boots set toe-to-toe, and my laugh, offered on purpose this time. Just a small warm sound that didn't belong to fear or bargains. The river took each like a smart animal, taking bread from a careful hand. The fog under the ice made an oval that did not ask for our palms. It drew instead a map of the day we owed it. First run at 9 when the light goes honest, barge to hug the inside bend, crew to call soundings out loud so the water can keep the lesson. It traced the last trick where the left-hand braid tempts pride. It stopped there and held, asking whether we understood. We nodded like people nodding at a sermon, not because they agree with the whole of it, but because they will do the piece of it that keeps them living. We broke camp, as if our hands had been taught by someone who watched. Guyline flaked clean. Stakes turned parallel on the ground before they went into their sack. Ash spread thin and cold. I wrote the channel with a pencil shaved down to its name. Eve read it back, and the river placed a single quiet crack through the thinnest pane in answer. "Trade complete," the CB said, and did not add more. The hand on the tent eased away like a child letting go. At 9, a low gray day laid itself over the banks, and the first barge came slow as a cow that knows which gate opens. We walked the flags like ushers, calling the bottom in measures the pilot would trust. The river wore its small courtesy like a pressed shirt. The fog under the ice stayed to its side of the glass. When the barge slid past the braid's last seduction, the deckhand raised 2 fingers off the rail. Not a wave exactly, more like a nod from a pew. The wake hummed the wands and made each flag say yes. When the stern was a dark parenthesis downriver, the ice breathed out and softened, as if the current had been holding its shoulders tight and could finally drop them. We ate late. The stove chewed its birch slow. I let the map lie on my knee until the pencil's black rubbed to my pants. The CB stayed quiet except for a tiny tick when frost shrugged inside its throat. When I stepped down to the river to rinse the cup, a little pouch nudged the eddy at my boot and turned its tag up obligingly. The name there read itself to me with the same clarity a kitchen clock reads noon. I didn't know her. The river waited, patient as a clerk. I set the cup on the snow, picked 3 smooth stones from the shallows, and built a cairn that looked foolish and sincere. "Work," I told the tag. Not names. The current stroked the ice, amused, and filed the pouch back into whatever long drawer keeps its ledgers. Near evening, the wind slid to the north and took the temperature down until even talk felt brittle. We tucked the last wand into the bank, tightened the last knot, pulled the line from willow to willow and coiled it in both our hands, so the river couldn't make it hum without asking. The channel lay clean. The fog respected the glass. The word did not come back. It didn't need to. We had taught it how to ask and how to be refused. Back in the tent, we set our boots toe-to-toe, not for superstition anymore, but because the day had a shape, and we meant to keep it from spilling. The stove ticked its little applause. Eve drifted with the spud bar under her palm like a lever she could throw if the world forgot itself. I lay awake to hear whether the river would try once more. Not with words this time, but with weather. It sent nothing. It had what we'd promised. When dawn should have come, the gray did not lift. The clock's red digits climbed, patient, unbothered, but the sky held its breath and kept its color. The channel rippled in the same light it had owned all night. I stepped out and looked east and found no seam where morning begins. "When the sky refuses to let morning come," Eve said quietly, the way a person quotes an old warning, "you count your tasks and do them anyway." We counted. We waited for a bright that did not arrive. The river moved like a thing that knew you by your chores and not by your face. It was the same color at noon,